The champagne flute trembled in my hand as Robert Chen's voice cut through the holiday music like a blade through silk. The twinkling lights of the Riverside Country Club's grand ballroom suddenly felt less magical and more like a spotlight exposing every flaw he believed I possessed. His words hung in the air between the Christmas wreaths and golden garland, each syllable dripping with the kind of disdain that money can't buy but privilege certainly breeds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Look at her, he whispered just loud enough for his circle of well-dressed cronies to hear, gesturing toward me with his crystal tumbler of aged whiskey. Playing dress-up in designer clothes, mingling with people who actually earned their place here. David's little charity case pretending she belongs at our table. The laughter that followed was soft but sharp, like breaking glass wrapped in velvet. I stood frozen near the silent auction display, my emerald dress suddenly feeling like a costume, my carefully applied makeup like war paint for a battle I hadn't known I was fighting. 24 pairs of eyes turned toward me with varying degrees of curiosity, pity, and barely concealed amusement. The holiday charity fundraiser that was supposed to celebrate giving and goodwill had transformed into my personal arena of judgment. My name is Natalie Brooks, I'm 29 years old, and I built an empire from nothing while everyone was busy looking the other way. This is the story of how a whispered insult at a Christmas party became the most expensive mistake a man ever made, and how sometimes the person you underestimate holds the keys to everything you think you own. The Riverside Country Club had always been Robert Chen's kingdom, a place where Connecticut's elite gathered to congratulate themselves on their success while writing tax-deductible checks to feel better about their excess. Tonight's Christmas charity gala was no different, with its ice sculptures shaped like angels and a string quartet playing classical arrangements of holiday favorites. The air smelled of expensive perfume, aged whiskey, and the particular brand of superiority that came with generational wealth. I had arrived 30 minutes earlier with David, Robert's eldest son, and the man I'd been quietly dating for 8 months. David worked in marketing for a tech startup, drove a modest Honda Civic, and lived in a one-bedroom apartment in West Hartford that he paid for with his own salary. He was nothing like his father, which was exactly what had drawn me to him in the first place. Where Robert was calculating and cold, David was warm and genuine. Where Robert measured people by their bank accounts and zip codes, David saw character and heart. But tonight, standing in his father's domain, I could see David shrinking back into the role of dutiful son, his shoulders tense as he navigated conversations with people who'd known him since childhood. He'd introduced me to his parents 6 months ago over a casual dinner, and while Linda Chen had been politely welcoming, Robert's reaction had been immediate and unmistakable. His eyes had swept over me with the practiced assessment of a man used to categorizing people by their usefulness, and I had clearly fallen into the temporary inconveniences category. What Robert knew about me could fit on a business card. He knew I'd grown up in foster care after my parents died in a car accident when I was 7. He knew I'd received a full scholarship to the University of Connecticut, which he'd discovered through what he probably considered thorough research but was really just casual gossip gathering. He knew I worked in finance, a deliberately vague description I'd given when pressed, and he knew I lived alone in what he assumed was a modest apartment somewhere in Hartford. What he didn't know could fill libraries. The conversation around me continued as I stood there, clutching my champagne and fighting the urge to either flee or fight. Patricia Wong, Robert's longtime business associate and board member of 3 different country clubs, leaned closer to her husband with barely concealed delight. I heard she grew up in the system, she stage whispered, the words the system pronounced like a communicable disease. Foster homes, food stamps, the whole tragic backstory. So sad really, but you have to wonder about her motivations, don't you? Her husband nodded sagely, as if they were discussing the weather rather than dissecting my life. Gold diggers are getting more sophisticated these days. They do their research, learn how to dress, how to speak. But you can always tell, can't you? Something about the way they hold themselves, like they're constantly afraid of being found out. Marcus Rodriguez, a local attorney whose family had been members here for 3 generations, chimed in with the authority of someone who'd never questioned his place in the world. The Chen boy is too kind-hearted for his own good. Someone needs to protect him from making a mistake that could affect the family business. These people are always looking for their big break, their ticket to the easy life. My fingers tightened around the champagne flute until I worried it might shatter. These people spoke about poverty like it was a character flaw, about growing up without privilege like it was something shameful that could be caught through close contact. They discussed my relationship with David as if I were a virus that needed to be treated before it could spread to their precious bloodline. Robert raised his voice slightly, ensuring his words would carry to where I stood. The scholarship girl thinks she can waltz into our world because she learned how to order wine and bought herself a dress that probably cost more than she makes in a month. But breeding shows, doesn't it? You can put a street dog in a show ring, but it's still just a street dog. The cruelty of it took my breath away. Not because it was unexpected, I'd felt his disapproval from the moment we'd been introduced, but because of the casual, confident way he delivered the blow. This wasn't anger or passion, this was calculated humiliation designed to put me in what he considered my proper place. He was establishing dominance in front of his pack, marking his territory by diminishing mine. I caught sight of David across the room, deep in conversation with his college roommate about something that had them both laughing. He hadn't heard his father's performance, hadn't seen the way his family's social circle had just spent 5 minutes dissecting my worthiness like I was a questionable piece of art at auction. Part of me was grateful he'd been spared witnessing this moment, but another part resented that he could remain blissfully unaware of the battle being waged around our relationship. Linda Chen appeared at my elbow with the kind of smile that rich women perfected in finishing school, all surface shine with no depth behind the eyes. "Natalie dear, you look lovely tonight. That dress is so ambitious. Where did you find it?" The compliment was wrapped in enough passive aggression to stock a small weapons depot. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm brewing in my chest. "I picked it up during a business trip to Milan last month." It wasn't a lie, I had been in Milan, closing a deal on a commercial property portfolio that would net my company 8 figures in profit over the next 5 years. But Linda heard what she wanted to hear, a girl playing dress up with money she probably didn't have. "Milan," she repeated with the tone of someone discovering a fascinating new species. "How cosmopolitan of you, I hope you didn't stretch your budget too much for one evening. These events can be so intimidating for people who aren't used to." She gestured vaguely at the opulence surrounding us. This level of formality. Robert had moved closer during our exchange, drawn by the scent of fresh blood in the water. "Now Linda, don't make the girl uncomfortable. I'm sure she's doing her best with what she has to work with." His smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Though I do wonder, Natalie, how you manage to afford evenings like this on your salary. David mentioned you work in finance, but he was rather vague about the specifics. What exactly is it that you do?" The question was a trap, and we both knew it. If I downplayed my role, I'd confirm their assumptions about my modest means. If I was too specific about my success, I'd risk seeming like I was boasting or worse, lying to impress them. Either way, Robert would find a way to use my answer as ammunition for his ongoing campaign to prove I didn't belong. "I work in private lending and real estate investment," I said carefully. "Nothing too exciting, but it pays the bills." "Private lending," Patricia Wong repeated with the kind of knowing nod that suggested she'd just solved a complex puzzle. "How interesting. I suppose there's always a market for people willing to take advantage of others' financial difficulties. Such a predatory industry, don't you think?" The accusation hung in the air, like smoke from a gun. In one sentence, she'd managed to twist my legitimate business into something unsavory, something that confirmed their worst assumptions about my character. I was no longer just a gold digger, I was someone who preyed on the vulnerable for profit. Robert's eyes lit up with predatory satisfaction. "Predatory lending. How fitting, I suppose you've found your natural habitat, haven't you? Taking advantage of people's desperation, profiting from their pain. It takes a certain type of person to sleep soundly knowing they've destroyed families for financial gain." The accusations were so far from the truth, they would have been laughable if they weren't so vicious. Brooks Capital Management specialized in bridge loans for legitimate developers, construction financing for community projects, and acquisition funding for commercial real estate. We had one of the lowest default rates in the industry precisely because we were careful about our investments and fair in our dealings. But Robert didn't want facts, he wanted weapons. "I think there might be some misunderstanding about what I actually do," I began, but Robert cut me off with a wave of his hand. "Oh, I'm sure you have all sorts of justifications and euphemisms for your work. They always do. Private lending, investment opportunities, helping people achieve their dreams. But at the end of the day, you're a loan shark in designer clothing, aren't you? Taking advantage of people's hopes and dreams, then crushing them when they can't meet your impossible terms." The Christmas music continued to play in the background, cheerful and completely at odds with the character assassination taking place in the corner of the ballroom. Other conversations had quieted as more people began to notice the drama unfolding, drawn by the magnetic pull of conflict and the promise of gossip they could dissect for weeks to come. I felt each heartbeat in my throat as I carefully set down my champagne flute on a nearby high-top table. The crystal made a soft clink against the white linen, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden pocket of silence that had formed around us. My hands were steady, but my mind was racing, calculating angles and consequences with the same precision I used to evaluate investment opportunities. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Chen," I said quietly, my voice carrying just far enough to reach the ears that were straining to hear my response. "I should know my place, thank you for reminding me exactly where that is." The smile that spread across Robert's face was triumphant and ugly, the expression of a man who believed he'd just scored a decisive victory. He'd successfully put the upstart in her place, protected his son from a fortune hunter, and entertained his friends with a public demonstration of his power and influence. In his mind, the evening couldn't have gone better. If only he knew. I turned away from the circle of judgment and walked slowly across the ballroom, my heels clicking against the marble floor with measured precision. Past the ice sculptures that were already beginning to show signs of melting under the warm lights. Past the silent auction displays featuring vacation packages to places these people visited multiple times a year.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Past the bar where servers in crisp white uniforms poured drinks that cost more than some families spent on groceries in a month. The weight of their stares followed me across the room, and I could already hear the whispered conversations starting up in my wake. By tomorrow morning, everyone in their social circle would know about Robert Chen's public takedown of his son's inappropriate girlfriend. The story would grow in the telling, becoming more dramatic and satisfying with each retelling, until I became not just a gold digger but a cartoon villain who'd finally been exposed and sent running. David intercepted me near the coat check, his face flushed with concern and confusion. He'd clearly picked up on the shift in the room's energy, even if he hadn't witnessed the specific cause. "Nat, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. What happened?" I looked up at him, this kind, decent man who'd somehow grown up surrounded by vipers without developing fangs of his own. His dark hair was slightly mussed from running his fingers through it, a nervous habit he'd never been able to break. His brown eyes held genuine worry, and I could see that he was ready to fight whatever dragon had upset me, even though he had no idea he'd have to start with his own father. "Your father just gave me some very valuable insight into how your family really feels about me," I said softly, reaching up to straighten his tie. "Don't worry about it, David. Sometimes people show you exactly who they are, and the kindest thing you can do is believe them." "What did he say?" David's jaw tightened, and I could see the muscles in his neck tensing as his protective instincts kicked in. "Natalie, whatever he said, you know I don't agree with it, right? You know that's not how I see you." I smiled, and it was genuine despite everything that had just happened. "I know exactly how you see me, and that's what matters. But this isn't your fight, David. Some battles have to be fought alone." "That's not true," he started to protest, but I placed a finger gently against his lips. "Trust me on this one. Give me some space to think, and I'll call you tomorrow, okay?" I kissed his cheek, tasting the salt of perspiration and the faint cologne he wore that always reminded me of cedar and rain. "I love you and that's not changing, but I need to handle this my way." He nodded reluctantly, clearly wanting to push for more details but respecting my request for space. "I love you too. And whatever my father said, whatever anyone said tonight, they don't know you. They don't know us." I retrieved my coat from the check and walked out into the December night, leaving behind the warmth and light of the country club for the crisp clarity of winter air. Snow was beginning to fall, tiny flakes that caught the light from the entrance before disappearing into the darkness. My car was parked in the guest section, a sleek black Tesla that had drawn some disapproving glances from the valet staff when I'd arrived. As I settled into the driver's seat and started the engine, my phone was already buzzing with notifications. I ignored them, knowing they were probably David calling to check on me, or perhaps Linda Chen attempting some damage control on behalf of her husband. None of those conversations could happen until I'd made the calls that actually mattered. I voice-dialed my assistant as I pulled out of the country club's circular driveway, watching the building shrink in my rearview mirror until it was just another collection of lights in the Connecticut darkness. "Caroline, I know it's late, but I need you to pull some files for me." Caroline Harper had been with me for 4 years, starting as a junior analyst fresh out of business school and rising to become my most trusted confidant and right hand. She'd seen me navigate hostile takeovers, difficult negotiations, and demanding clients, but she'd never heard the particular edge that was creeping into my voice tonight. Of course, Miss Brooks, what do you need? Everything we have on Chen Construction and Development. Financial statements, outstanding loans, project timelines, vendor relationships, everything. Also, I want a complete portfolio review of any properties we hold mortgages on in the Riverside Heights area. There was a pause, then the sound of Caroline's fingers flying across her keyboard. She worked from her home office most evenings, a converted bedroom in her condo that was probably better equipped than most corporate headquarters. Should I be asking why we're suddenly interested in Chen Construction at 10:30 on a Friday night? Let's just say I've had an illuminating conversation with Robert Chen tonight, and I'd like to better understand the scope of his business operations. Robert Chen, Caroline repeated slowly. Isn't that David's father? The one you were meeting tonight at the holiday party, the very same. I merged onto the highway that would take me back to Hartford, the city lights spreading out below like a constellation of possibilities. How long will it take you to compile everything? Give me 2 hours. I'll have a full report ready by midnight, including some interesting details I think you'll want to see immediately. Interesting how? Caroline's voice took on the tone she used when she'd discovered something particularly juicy during her research. Well, I can't be completely certain until I run the numbers, but from what I'm seeing in our portfolio, it looks like Brooks Capital might have a more significant relationship with the Chen family than they realize. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. How significant? Significant enough that Robert Chen's opinion of predatory lenders might be about to become very personal indeed. I hung up and drove the rest of the way to my penthouse in thoughtful silence, already beginning to piece together the picture Caroline was painting. Robert Chen thought he knew exactly who I was, and what I represented. He'd built his assessment on assumptions, stereotypes, and a fundamental misunderstanding of both my background and my current position in the world. Tomorrow, he would learn the difference between appearance and reality. Tonight he'd humiliated someone he thought was powerless to fight back. By morning he would discover just how expensive that mistake was going to be. The elevator to my penthouse felt slower than usual as I ascended 30 floors above downtown Hartford, each floor marking another layer between me and the humiliation I'd just endured. The city stretched out below through the glass walls, a tapestry of lights that reminded me of every late night I'd spent building something Robert Chen couldn't even comprehend. My reflection stared back at me from the polished steel doors, emerald dress still perfectly fitted, makeup still flawless, but my eyes held a coldness that hadn't been there when I'd left for the party. The penthouse door opened to reveal 3,000 square feet of modern minimalism, floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the Connecticut River and the city beyond. This was my sanctuary, a space I'd designed to reflect not where I'd come from, but where I'd arrived. Clean lines, neutral colors, and carefully chosen art pieces that spoke to success earned rather than inherited. The silence was profound after the chaos of the country club, broken only by the soft hum of the climate control system and the distant sound of traffic far below. I poured myself 3 fingers of 18-year-old Macallan and settled onto the Italian leather sofa facing the windows. The scotch burned just enough to remind me I was alive, to ground me in the present moment rather than getting lost in the fury that threatened to consume rational thought. My phone lay silent on the glass coffee table, screen dark, but somehow heavy with the weight of calls I needed to make, and decisions that would reshape lives. Caroline's preliminary report arrived at 11:47, sent to my secure email with the kind of thorough professionalism that had made her indispensable to Brooks Capital's operations. I opened it on my tablet, already knowing that what I was about to read would transform tonight from a personal humiliation into a business opportunity of biblical proportions. Chen Construction and Development had been hemorrhaging money for 18 months. What appeared on the surface to be a thriving family business was actually a house of cards held together by creative accounting, extended payment terms with suppliers, and a complex web of loans that Robert had been juggling like a desperate street performer. The company had overextended itself on 3 major residential developments in Fairfield County, betting big on a luxury housing market that had softened considerably in the past year. But the truly devastating information came in the portfolio review Caroline had compiled. Brooks Capital Management held the primary mortgages on not just Robert's personal residence on Maple Ridge Drive, but also on the commercial properties that housed Chen Construction's headquarters, warehouse facilities, and 2 of their active development sites. The loans had been originated through a network of subsidiary companies and shell corporations that obscured the ultimate lender, a common practice in commercial real estate that allowed for privacy and flexibility in business dealings. Robert Chen had been paying my company roughly $60,000 a month across all his various loans for the past 3 years, never knowing that the money was flowing directly into the accounts of the woman he'd just called a street dog in designer clothing. The irony was so perfect it felt almost orchestrated by some cosmic sense of justice. I scrolled through the detailed financial analysis, noting payment histories, loan terms, and most importantly default provisions. Robert had been skating on thin ice for months, making minimum payments and requesting extensions that my loan officers had granted based on his reputation and track record. But reputation was a fragile thing, and track records could be re-examined in light of new information. My phone rang at exactly midnight, Caroline's timing as precise as always. "I assume you've had a chance to review the preliminary findings," she said without preamble. "Should I ask what Robert Chen did tonight to earn this level of attention?" "He reminded me of my place in the world," I replied, taking another sip of scotch. "I thought it was only fair to return the favor." Natalie Caroline's voice carried the warning tone she used when she thought I might be letting emotion cloud business judgment. "Whatever happened tonight, we need to be very careful here. Chen Construction employs 47 people, most of them local contractors and laborers. If we move too aggressively, there will be collateral damage." She was right, of course. One of the things that separated Brooks Capital from the predatory lenders Robert had accused me of being was our commitment to responsible business practices. We didn't destroy lives for profit, and we didn't use financial weapons against people who couldn't defend themselves. But Robert Chen wasn't one of those people. He was a wealthy man who had built his success on the same kind of privilege and connections he'd used to humiliate me tonight. "Pull together a comprehensive restructuring proposal for Monday morning," I instructed. "I want options that protect the employees and subcontractors while making it clear that Robert's days of calling the shots are over. Can we do that?" "Absolutely. I'll have legal review the acceleration clauses on all the loans, and I'll put together a proposal for a management buyout that removes Robert from operational control. We can structure it so the company survives and the workers keep their jobs, but Robert loses his kingdom." "Perfect. And Caroline, I want this handled with complete discretion until we're ready to move. No leaks, no hints, nothing that tips him off before we're prepared to execute." "Understood. Should I expect any pushback from David when this becomes public?" I paused, considering the question that had been nagging at me since I'd left the country club. David was genuinely good-hearted, the kind of man who saw the best in people even when they didn't deserve it. Learning that his girlfriend had essentially foreclosed on his father's business empire would force him to choose between family loyalty and personal principles. It wasn't a choice I wanted to force on him, but Robert had made it inevitable. "David will need to make his own decisions about where his loyalties lie," I said finally. "I hope he'll understand that this isn't about revenge, it's about consequences." His father spent years building a business on other people's money, then had the audacity to lecture me about predatory lending practices. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor about these things. After ending the call with Caroline, I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and stared out at the city below. Hartford wasn't New York or Boston, but it was home in a way that transcended geography. Every building, every street corner, every glowing window represented someone's dream, someone's struggle, someone's small piece of the American promise that hard work and determination could overcome any disadvantage. I'd been 7 years old when the state trooper had knocked on our apartment door to tell me my parents wouldn't be coming home from their weekend trip to New York. 7 years old when I'd learned that life could change in an instant, that security was an illusion, and that the only person you could really count on was yourself. The foster homes that followed had reinforced those lessons, teaching me that kindness was often conditional, and that people's opinions of your worth were usually based on circumstances beyond your control. But those same experiences had also taught me resilience, self-reliance, and the kind of hunger for success that couldn't be satisfied by simply maintaining what you'd inherited. While Robert Chen was learning to manage family money and navigate social expectations, I was learning to survive, to adapt, and to never accept other people's limitations as my own. The University of Connecticut scholarship had been my first real break, but it had also been my first taste of the kind of casual cruelty that came with class differences. Professors who assumed I wouldn't understand complex concepts because of my background. Classmates who treated me like an interesting sociological specimen rather than an equal. Study groups that somehow always met at expensive restaurants or exclusive venues I couldn't afford. But business school had also introduced me to mentors who saw potential rather than pedigree, and it was there that I'd first learned about real estate investment trusts, private lending, and the complex financial instruments that would eventually become the foundation of my empire. By the time I graduated, I had a business plan, seed funding from a professor who believed in my vision, and an unshakable determination to prove that success was about results, not resumes. Brooks Capital Management had started in a studio apartment with borrowed furniture and a laptop that crashed twice a week. The first loan I'd originated was for $12,000 to help a small contractor buy materials for a kitchen renovation project. The client had been turned down by 3 traditional banks because his credit history showed some late payments from when his wife had been battling cancer. I'd evaluated the deal based on his track record, his work ethic, and the strength of the contract he'd secured, and 6 months later he'd paid back the loan with interest and referred 2 other contractors who became long-term clients. From there, the business had grown organically, one satisfied client leading to another, one successful project opening doors to larger opportunities. I'd reinvested every penny of profit back into the business, living modestly while building a reputation for fairness, reliability, and results. By year 3, we were handling multi-million-dollar commercial deals. By year 5, we had our own office building and a staff of 12. By year 7, Brooks Capital was one of the most respected private lending institutions in New England. The success hadn't come without sacrifice. Relationships that couldn't survive my 12-hour workdays and weekend client meetings. Social events I'd missed because I was on conference calls with investors in different time zones. Family dinners I'd never attended because I'd never found a family that understood what I was trying to build or why it mattered so much. Meeting David had been unexpected, a chance encounter at a coffee shop where we'd both been waiting for the same ridiculously complicated drink order. He'd offered to let me go first. I'd suggested we split a table since the place was packed, and somehow 3 hours had passed in what felt like minutes. He'd made me laugh without trying to impress me, listened to my stories without judgment, and showed genuine interest in my work without immediately calculating what it might mean for his own prospects. For 8 months I'd allowed myself to believe that I'd found someone who saw past the surface, who valued character over connections. David's modest lifestyle and genuine warmth had convinced me that he was different from the privileged crowd he'd grown up in. Tonight had shattered that illusion, not because of anything David had done, but because it had forced me to confront the reality of what dating him actually meant. I would always be the scholarship girl who got lucky, the foster kid who'd clawed her way up from nothing, the outsider trying to infiltrate a world that would never truly accept her. No matter what I accomplished, no matter how much wealth I accumulated, no matter how many people depended on my business for their livelihoods, I would always be judged by where I'd started rather than where I'd arrived. The Macallan was doing its job, dulling the sharp edges of anger while sharpening my focus on what needed to happen next. Robert Chen had drawn a line tonight, forcing me to choose between accepting his judgment or proving him wrong in the most definitive way possible. He'd made his choice about what kind of person he thought I was. Now I would make mine about what kind of person he would discover me to be. My secure phone rang at 2:30 in the morning, the display showing Marcus Rodriguez's personal number. Marcus wasn't just Brooks Capital's preferred real estate attorney, he was also one of the few people who knew the full scope of my business operations, and the only lawyer I trusted with sensitive matters that required both discretion and creative problem-solving. "I got Caroline's preliminary report," he said without greeting. "Please tell me you're not about to do something spectacularly stupid because someone hurt your feelings at a party." "Good morning to you too, Marcus, and no, this isn't about hurt feelings. This is about business fundamentals and natural consequences. Natalie, I've known you for 6 years. I've seen you navigate hostile takeovers, deal with threatening clients, and handle regulatory investigations without losing your temper. You don't call emergency portfolio reviews at midnight because of business fundamentals." Marcus had a point, but he also had a limited understanding of what had transpired at the country club. He'd grown up in privilege himself, attending private schools and Ivy League universities, before joining his family's white shoe law firm. For all his professional competence and personal loyalty, he'd never experienced the particular brand of humiliation that came from being publicly dismissed as unworthy of respect. Robert Chen spent tonight explaining to a room full of his friends and business associates that I'm a gold-digging predator who profits from other people's pain. He called me street garbage in designer clothing and suggested that I'm too stupid to realize I don't belong in polite society. He did this while I was standing 10 feet away, attending an event as his son's guest, after I'd done nothing more offensive than exist in his presence. The line was quiet for a long moment. Jesus, Natalie. I'm sorry, that's completely unacceptable. And David should have shut him down immediately. David didn't hear it. Robert was careful to perform for his audience when his son was safely across the room. This was calculated, Marcus. He wanted to humiliate me, establish dominance, and send a message to everyone present that I knew my place in their social hierarchy. And your response is to destroy his business. My response is to enforce the terms of legally binding contracts that he signed willingly and has been struggling to meet for months. Nothing I'm proposing is illegal, unethical, or outside the normal scope of commercial lending practices. The only difference is that now I have a personal interest in ensuring those contracts are executed to the letter. Marcus sighed, the sound of a man who'd spent enough time in courtrooms to recognize when legal arguments were being used to justify personal vendettas. Walk me through what you're thinking. Full disclosure, complete transparency about objectives and methods. I outlined the restructuring plan Caroline and I had discussed, emphasizing the provisions for employee protection and business continuity. The goal wasn't to punish innocent people or destroy a functional company, but to remove Robert from a position where he could continue to wield his wealth and influence as weapons against people he considered beneath him. It's elegant, Marcus admitted grudgingly. Completely legal, arguably justified by the company's financial performance, and structured to minimize collateral damage. But it's also going to generate headlines, and not all of them will be favorable to you or Brooks Capital. Let me worry about the headlines. Can you have the acceleration notices ready by Monday morning? I can, but I want to go on record as advising against this course of action. Not because it's legally problematic, but because it's going to change how people perceive you and your company. Right now, Brooks Capital has a reputation for being tough but fair. After this, you'll be known as someone who uses financial leverage to settle personal scores. Marcus, do you know what Robert Chen's first words to me were when David introduced us 6 months ago? I have no idea. He asked me what I did for work, and when I told him I was in private lending, he immediately wanted to know if I was licensed and bonded. Not because he was impressed or curious about the industry, but because he assumed I was some kind of payday loan operator, taking advantage of desperate people in bad neighborhoods. He'd made his judgment about my character and my business before I'd finished explaining what Brooks Capital actually does. So this is about proving a point. This is about natural consequences. Robert Chen has spent months paying interest on loans from a company he would have refused to do business with if he'd known who actually owned it. He's been subsidizing the success of someone he considers fundamentally inferior to himself and his social circle. The cosmic irony is already complete. I'm just making sure he understands the punchline. By the time I ended the call with Marcus, the city was beginning to show signs of mourning. Early commuters moved along the distant streets like ants following predetermined paths, each one carrying their own dreams and disappointments, their own stories of triumph and struggle. The sun hadn't yet appeared, but the eastern horizon was beginning to lighten with the promise of a new day and new possibilities. I showered and changed into comfortable clothes, then settled into my home office to review the documents Caroline had compiled. The financial picture was even worse than her preliminary report had suggested. Chen Construction was essentially insolvent, surviving month to month on extended payment terms, delayed vendor payments, and creative accounting that pushed problems into future quarters rather than solving them. Robert's personal finances were more stable but heavily leveraged. The house on Maple Ridge Drive was worth approximately $4.2 million, but he owed nearly $3 million against it through various mortgages and credit lines. His investment portfolio had taken substantial hits in the recent market downturn, and his monthly expenses far exceeded his actual income from the construction company. On paper, he looked like exactly the kind of borrower that responsible lenders avoided: too much debt, too little liquidity, and too much of his net worth tied up in illiquid assets. The only reason Brooks Capital had approved his loans was his reputation, his business history, and the assumption that someone with his family background and social connections represented a safe risk. But reputation was a fragile thing, and assumptions could be re-examined when new information became available. Tonight had provided plenty of new information about Robert Chen's character, judgment, and fitness as a business partner. My phone buzzed with a text message from David, sent at 3:47 in the morning. Can't sleep. Keep thinking about tonight. Whatever my father said, I'm sorry. I love you and want to make this right. I stared at the message for several minutes, thumb hovering over the keyboard as I tried to find words that would be both honest and kind. David was genuinely good-hearted, but he was also naive about the realities of what his family represented, and how their wealth insulated them from consequences that ordinary people faced every day. By Monday evening, his father's business empire would be in ruins, and David would be forced to choose between the woman he claimed to love, and the family that had shaped his entire worldview. I love you too, I finally replied. Get some sleep, we'll talk tomorrow and figure everything out. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. By tomorrow there would be much more to figure out than David could possibly imagine. The rest of Saturday morning passed in careful preparation. Caroline arrived at 10 with hard copies of all the relevant documents, legal briefs outlining our rights and remedies under each loan agreement, and a detailed timeline for the restructuring process. Marcus joined us by conference call to review the acceleration notices and ensure that every legal requirement was met before we moved forward. The plan was surgical in its precision. Brooks Capital would exercise its rights under the default provisions of Chen Construction's commercial loans, demanding immediate payment of all outstanding balances. When Robert inevitably failed to meet those demands, we would foreclose on the commercial properties and liquidate the assets to satisfy the debt. The residential mortgage on his personal home would follow the same process, though Massachusetts law provided additional consumer protections that would extend the timeline somewhat. The beauty of the plan was that it required nothing more than enforcing contracts Robert had willingly signed. Every document had been reviewed by his own attorneys, every term negotiated and agreed to by both parties. He'd received fair value for the money he'd borrowed, and Brooks Capital had performed exactly as promised under the terms of each agreement. If Robert had managed his business responsibly, maintained adequate cash reserves, and avoided over-leveraging his assets, none of this would be possible. His financial house of cards was a product of his own choices, his own risk tolerance, and his own belief that his reputation and connections would always provide a safety net when things got difficult. By Monday morning, he would discover that safety nets had a limited capacity, and that some falls were too far for any amount of social capital to cushion. Caroline left at noon to spend the weekend with her family, but not before extracting a promise that I would think carefully about the broader implications of what we were planning. She understood my anger and supported my right to defend myself against unfair attacks, but she also worried that this level of response might escalate beyond what the situation actually warranted. I know he hurt you, she said, as she packed up her files. And I know it wasn't just about words. But once we start this process, there's no taking it back. Are you absolutely certain this is how you want to handle it? Caroline, let me ask you something. If Robert Chen had made those comments about you, what would you want me to do? She considered the question seriously, her expression thoughtful rather than reflexively supportive. I'd want you to defend me. I'd want there to be consequences for that kind of behavior, but I'm not sure I'd want you to destroy his entire life over it. I'm not destroying his life. I'm enforcing the terms of contracts he signed when he needed my money to keep his business afloat. The fact that he didn't bother to research who he was actually borrowing from is his responsibility, not mine. And if David can't forgive you for this, the question hit harder than I'd expected, forcing me to confront the possibility that had been lurking in the back of my mind since I'd walked out of the country club. David was a good man, but he was also Robert's son, shaped by 29 years of family loyalty and shared history that I could never fully understand or compete with. Then I'll know where his priorities really lie, I said finally. And I'll have learned something important about the relationship before I invested even more of myself in it. Caroline nodded and gave me a brief hug before leaving, her expression still concerned but resigned to my decision. She'd been with me long enough to recognize when my mind was truly made up, and she knew that trying to change course now would only create tension between us without altering the outcome. The weekend passed slowly, each hour bringing me closer to Monday morning and the point of no return. I spent Saturday evening having dinner with my neighbor, an elderly woman named Rose, who'd become something of a surrogate grandmother since I'd moved into the building. She'd been a teacher for 40 years before retiring, and she had the kind of quiet wisdom that came from watching generations of students navigate the transition from childhood dreams to adult realities. You seem troubled, dear, she observed over dessert, her sharp eyes missing nothing despite her 83 years. Is everything all right with that young man you've been seeing? I found myself telling her the whole story, leaving out the specific business details, but explaining the fundamental conflict between David's world and mine. Rose listened without judgment. asking occasional clarifying questions, but mostly just providing the kind of patient attention that allowed me to work through my thoughts out loud. "It sounds like you're facing a choice between being accepted and being respected," she said when I'd finished. "Those aren't always the same thing, especially when you're dealing with people who've never had to earn either one." His father made it clear that I'll never be accepted, regardless of what I accomplish or how I conduct myself, so I suppose that makes the choice easier. Does it, or does it just make the stakes higher? Rose refilled our coffee cups, her movements careful and deliberate despite the arthritis that had gnarled her fingers. Acceptance can be withdrawn as easily as it's given. But respect, real respect, has to be earned through actions, not given as a gift or a favor. "So you think I should go through with this?" "I think you should do what you believe is right, not what's easy or popular or safe. You've built something remarkable, Natalie, but you've done it while trying to fit into spaces that weren't designed for someone like you. Maybe it's time to stop fitting in and start creating space for others who need it." Sunday morning brought a call from David, requesting a meeting that afternoon to discuss what had happened at the party. His voice was strained, suggesting he'd spent the weekend trying to piece together the evening's events from second-hand accounts and half-overheard conversations. We agreed to meet at a quiet cafe in West Hartford, neutral territory that wouldn't carry the weight of either his family's expectations or my professional associations. He was already waiting when I arrived, occupying a corner booth with 2 coffee cups and an expression that reminded me painfully of the first time we'd met. The easy confidence that usually characterized his demeanor had been replaced by uncertainty and something that looked like preemptive grief. "I talked to my mother yesterday," he said without preamble, as I slid into the booth across from him. "She told me what my father said to you, and to his friends about you. Natalie, I'm so sorry. I had no idea he felt that way, and I certainly didn't know he was capable of being so cruel in public." "But you're not surprised," I observed, reading the resignation in his posture and the way his shoulders seemed to carry a weight that hadn't been there a week ago. "I'm not surprised that he disapproves of our relationship. He's made that clear in private conversations over the past few months. But I am surprised by how vicious he was willing to be, and how calculated the whole performance seemed to be." David wrapped his hands around his coffee cup like he was trying to draw warmth from it, though the cafe was perfectly comfortable. "My mother said you left with dignity, that you didn't respond to his provocations or try to defend yourself. She seemed almost impressed by how you handled it. Your mother was there when it happened. She was close enough to hear everything. She said the whole conversation made her ashamed to be associated with his behavior." David's jaw tightened. "She also said that several other people looked uncomfortable with what was happening, but nobody spoke up to stop it. I wouldn't expect them to. That's not how these things work in your father's world." "It's not my world," David said firmly. "I grew up in it, but that doesn't mean I accept it or want to perpetuate it. You know that, don't you?" I studied his face, looking for signs of the entitlement and casual cruelty that seemed to run in his family like a genetic trait. David had always been different, more grounded and empathetic than his background would suggest. But tonight had forced me to wonder if that difference was real, or just a luxury he could afford, because he'd never been truly challenged to choose between his principles and his privilege. "I know that's what you believe," I said carefully. "But belief and action aren't always the same thing. It's easy to reject your father's values in theory. It's harder to reject them when doing so costs you something meaningful." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that your father drew a line Friday night, and now we all have to decide which side we're on. You can't stay neutral in a conflict where one party has declared the other fundamentally unworthy of respect." David reached across the table to take my hand, his touch warm and familiar, despite the tension crackling between us. "You're talking like this is some kind of war. It doesn't have to be. We can rise above his prejudices, prove him wrong through our actions and our happiness together. Can we? Or will I just spend the rest of our relationship being grateful for your willingness to overlook my inadequacies?" I pulled my hand back gently. "David, I need you to understand something. I'm not going to spend my life apologizing for where I came from or proving that I deserve to be treated with basic human decency. If your father wants to declare war on my character and my worth, then he's going to discover that I'm better equipped for that fight than he realizes." Something in my tone must have alerted him to the seriousness of what I was saying, because his expression shifted from concern to alarm. "Natalie, what are you planning?" "I'm planning to show your father exactly who he chose to insult. Nothing more, nothing less." That sounds ominous. It sounds like natural consequences. We finished our coffee in relative silence, both of us recognizing that we were approaching a crossroads that would define not just our relationship but our individual characters. David was a good man caught between competing loyalties, and I genuinely felt sorry for the position his father had put him in. But sympathy couldn't change the fundamental mathematics of the situation. Robert Chen had forced a choice between accepting his judgment or proving him catastrophically wrong. I'd spent most of my life accepting other people's limitations and working around their prejudices, but I'd also spent years building the kind of power that made acceptance optional. Tomorrow morning, Robert would learn the difference between charity and justice, between appearance and reality, and between inherited privilege and earned respect. By Monday evening, the lesson would be complete, and everyone involved would understand exactly where they stood in the new order of things. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp December air that made everything seem sharper, more defined. I stood in my office on the 22nd floor of the Hartford Financial Center, watching the city come alive below as early commuters hurried along sidewalks dusted with fresh snow. The irony wasn't lost on me that Brooks Capital Management occupied the same building where Robert Chen had once pitched a development project to city planners, back when he thought government contracts and political connections were the keys to sustainable success. Caroline arrived at 7:30 with the final documentation, her usual professional composure masking what I knew was deep concern about the day's agenda. She'd spent her weekend cross-referencing every detail of our legal position, ensuring that when we moved against Chen Construction, our actions would be unassailable from both legal and ethical standpoints. The stack of files she placed on my desk represented months of meticulous record-keeping and years of careful relationship management that Robert had never bothered to investigate. The acceleration notices were works of art in their precision and devastating clarity. Each document outlined specific loan terms, payment histories, and the exact provisions Robert had triggered through his company's deteriorating financial performance. The language was formal and emotionless, the kind of bureaucratic prose that transformed personal catastrophes into routine business procedures. But beneath the legal terminology lay the complete dismantling of everything Robert Chen had spent decades building. Marcus arrived by 8, his expression grim but determined as he reviewed the final documents one last time. As Brooks Capital's primary legal counsel, he understood the implications of what we were about to unleash better than anyone. This wasn't just a standard foreclosure action, it was a coordinated assault on an entire business empire, executed with surgical precision and perfect timing to maximize both immediate impact and long-term consequences. The commercial property foreclosures will hit his business first, Marcus explained, spreading the documents across the conference table like a general planning a military campaign. Chen Construction will lose their headquarters, warehouse facilities, and 2 active development sites within 30 days. That alone will force him into bankruptcy proceedings, which will trigger cross-default provisions on his personal mortgages. What about the employees? I asked, though I already knew the answer from our weekend conversations. I meant what I said about protecting the people who actually do the work. I've structured the foreclosure sale to favor buyers who agree to retain existing staff for at least 6 months. The company's core assets and client relationships have real value, they just need management that understands cash flow and risk assessment. Most of the workers will probably end up better off under new ownership. Caroline pulled up financial projections on the large monitor that dominated one wall of the conference room. The timing couldn't be worse for Robert personally. His investment portfolio is down 37% from last year's highs, and he's been using credit lines to maintain his lifestyle while the construction business burned through operating capital. Even if he liquidates everything, he won't have enough to satisfy the accelerated loan balances. I studied the numbers with the same detached analysis I'd use for any other distressed borrower, but the personal satisfaction running beneath my professional demeanor was impossible to ignore. Robert Chen had spent Friday evening lecturing a room full of people about my character and my business practices, never imagining that his own financial survival depended entirely on my continued goodwill and discretion. The first acceleration notice would be hand-delivered to Chen Construction's headquarters at 9 o'clock sharp, timed to arrive just as Robert would be settling into his morning routine of reviewing project reports and barking orders at subordinates. The personal mortgage acceleration would follow 24 hours later, giving him just enough time to understand the scope of what was happening before the second wave hit. I want to be clear about something, I said as Caroline prepared to dispatch the courier with the documents. This isn't about revenge, and it's not about destroying lives for the sake of destruction. Robert Chen made a choice Friday night to publicly humiliate someone he considered powerless to respond. Today he learns that his assumptions about power were fundamentally flawed. Natalie Marcus said carefully, "You know I support your right to enforce these contracts, but once we start this process, it's going to generate attention from media, competitors, and regulatory agencies. Are you prepared for the scrutiny that comes with being known as someone who foreclosed on dozens of properties in a coordinated action?" The question was fair, and I'd spent considerable time over the weekend thinking about the broader implications of what I was about to do. Brooks Capital had built its reputation on discretion, professionalism, and a careful balance between aggressive business practices and community responsibility. What I was planning would certainly test those boundaries, and some observers would inevitably conclude that I'd crossed the line from justified business action to personal vendetta. "I've been thinking about that," I replied. "And I've decided that there are worse things than being known as someone who holds people accountable for their actions." Robert spent years borrowing money from a company he would have refused to do business with if he'd known who actually owned it. He's been subsidizing the success of someone he publicly dismissed as inferior and unworthy of respect. The cosmic justice is already complete. I'm just making sure he understands the punchline. At 8:45, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Chen Construction's main number, but the voice that answered wasn't Robert's. Instead, I heard the nervous tone of someone who'd clearly been ordered to make a call they didn't want to make. "Miss Brooks, this is Jennifer Walsh, Mr. Chen's executive assistant. Chen was wondering if he could schedule a meeting with you sometime this week to discuss some mutual business interests." The timing was interesting. Robert had obviously spent his weekend doing the kind of research he should have completed 3 years ago when he'd first applied for Brooks Capital's financing. Somewhere between Saturday morning and Monday morning, he'd discovered that the woman he'd publicly humiliated on Friday night was the same person who held the financial future of his business empire in her hands. "I'm afraid Mr. Chen missed his window for polite business discussions," I replied. "He'll be receiving some documentation shortly that should clarify the current state of our mutual business interests. After he's had a chance to review that information with his attorneys, he's welcome to contact my office through appropriate legal channels." Jennifer's silence suggested she'd been expecting a different response, possibly some indication that I was willing to pretend Friday night had never happened. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried the strain of someone delivering bad news to a boss who didn't handle disappointment well. "Mr. Chen asked me to tell you that he's prepared to discuss any concerns you might have about his company's loan performance. He said to mention that he values the professional relationship Brooks Capital has maintained with Chen Construction." Professional relationship. The phrase was carefully chosen, a not-so-subtle attempt to reframe Friday night's character assassination as a separate matter from our business dealings. Robert was trying to compartmentalize his personal prejudices from his financial obligations, hoping I would be reasonable enough to accept his implicit apology in exchange for maintaining the status quo. "Please tell Mr. Chen that Brooks Capital takes a holistic approach to our client relationships. We evaluate borrowers based not just on their financial performance, but on their character, judgment, and fitness as business partners. Recent events have provided new information in all of those categories." I ended the call and nodded to Caroline, who immediately signaled the courier waiting in our lobby. The acceleration notices were already in motion, racing across downtown Hartford toward their target like guided missiles programmed to detonate Robert's comfortable assumptions about power, privilege, and consequences. My phone began ringing within minutes of the courier's departure, calls from numbers I recognized as Chen Construction's various department heads and project managers. Word was spreading through the company that something significant was happening, though the full scope wouldn't become clear until Robert's attorneys had time to review the legal documents and explain what acceleration clauses meant in practical terms. The first media inquiry came at 10:15, a call from a Hartford Courant business reporter who'd apparently been monitoring commercial real estate filings and noticed the unusual pattern of foreclosure actions involving Chen Construction properties. Caroline handled the call with her usual professional discretion, confirming only that Brooks Capital was exercising standard contractual remedies for loan performance issues and declining to comment on specific borrower relationships. By 10:30, my secure line was ringing with a call from David. His voice carried the kind of controlled panic that came from watching a familiar world suddenly become unpredictable and dangerous. "Natalie, what the hell is happening? My father just called me screaming about foreclosure notices and demanding to know what I told you about the family business. I've never seen him this angry or this scared. Your father is experiencing the natural consequences of decisions he made both recently and over the past several years. I'm not sure what you want me to tell you that wouldn't compromise confidential business information. This is about Friday night, isn't it? About what he said at the party. David's voice cracked with the strain of trying to hold together relationships that were rapidly pulling in opposite directions. Natalie, please don't do this. Whatever you're planning, there has to be another way to handle it. There was another way. Your father could have treated me with basic human decency when I was a guest in his social circle, attending an event to support him and his family. He chose a different approach, and now he's learning about consequences. You're going to destroy his business over something he said when he was drunk. The question revealed everything wrong with David's understanding of the situation. He was still thinking in terms of proportionality, as if there was some acceptable level of public humiliation that I should be willing to absorb in exchange for the privilege of dating him. He couldn't see that Friday night had simply revealed truths that had existed all along, forcing decisions that had been postponed but never avoided. David, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Your father didn't just insult me when he was drunk. He spent months borrowing money from my company while privately despising me as a person. He took my capital, benefited from my judgment, and relied on my discretion, all while believing that I was fundamentally inferior to him and his social circle. The drinking didn't create those beliefs, it just made him honest about them. So you're bankrupting him. I'm enforcing the terms of contracts he signed when he needed my money to keep his business afloat. The fact that he never bothered to research who he was actually dealing with is his responsibility, not mine. The silence on David's end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had been dropped. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a resignation that made my chest tighten with unexpected grief for what we were both about to lose. You know I can't choose you over my family, he said quietly. Even if I think you're right, even if he brought this on himself, I can't be part of destroying everything he's worked for his entire life. I know, I replied, meaning it completely. And I can't be part of a relationship where I have to constantly prove that I deserve to be treated with respect. We both knew this moment was coming eventually. Your father just forced it to happen sooner rather than later. This isn't how I wanted things to end between us. This isn't how I wanted things to begin. But your father made those choices for all of us when he decided that public humiliation was an appropriate way to express his disapproval. After ending the call with David, I stood at my office window watching the city continue its daily routine, unaware that several miles away a man's carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. The snow had stopped falling, leaving Hartford covered in a pristine white blanket that would last until afternoon traffic turned it into gray slush. The metaphor was almost too perfect, surface beauty hiding the messy realities underneath. Caroline knocked on my door at 11:30 with an expression that suggested more interesting developments. Robert Chen is in the lobby, she announced. No appointment, no attorney, no advance notice. Security says he's demanding to see you immediately, and making enough noise that other tenants are starting to complain. The image of Robert Chen reduced to making scenes in office building lobbies was satisfying in ways I hadn't expected. This was a man who'd spent decades commanding respect through wealth, connections, and social position. The idea that he would abandon dignity to beg for mercy from someone he'd publicly dismissed as garbage spoke volumes about just how desperate his situation had become. Send him up, I decided. But have security stand by in case he becomes more than verbally aggressive. And Caroline, I want you to record everything. If this conversation becomes relevant to future legal proceedings, I want a complete record. Robert looked significantly different from the confident patriarch who'd held court at the country club 3 days earlier. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain, hair slightly disheveled, tie askew, expensive suit wrinkled as if he'd been wearing it since dawn. The man who dismissed me as street garbage now carried himself with the hunched desperation of someone who understood that his assumptions about power had been catastrophically wrong. He entered my office without invitation, his eyes sweeping across the understated luxury of the space with the kind of assessment that came from years of judging people by their possessions. The custom furniture, original artwork, and panoramic city views clearly registered as evidence of success that didn't match his preconceptions about my background and capabilities. Miss Brooks, he began, his voice carrying forced politeness that barely concealed deeper anger. I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding about my company's loan obligations. I've been a reliable borrower for 3 years, never missed a payment, always maintained open communication with your staff. Please sit down, Mr. Chen. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. Though I should point out that your payment history shows multiple extensions, modified terms, and requests for temporary relief over the past 18 months. That's not exactly the record of a borrower who's comfortably meeting his obligations. Robert remained standing, clearly hoping to maintain some psychological advantage through physical positioning. Those were minor adjustments to accommodate market conditions and project timelines. Standard practices in the construction industry. Nothing that justified the extreme action you've taken today. Extreme action. I leaned back in my chair, maintaining the kind of calm demeanor that I knew would be more unsettling than any emotional response. I've simply exercised contractual rights that were clearly spelled out in documents your own attorneys reviewed and approved. Every provision I'm enforcing was negotiated in good faith and agreed to by both parties. You know damn well this isn't about contract enforcement. Robert's careful politeness began to crack, revealing the anger that had been building since he'd received the morning's legal documents. This is about revenge. You're using your position to punish me for something that happened at a private social event. The admission was exactly what I'd been waiting for. Robert's willingness to connect Friday night's humiliation with Monday morning's business consequences proved that he understood the relationship between his actions and their results. He wasn't confused about why this was happening. He was angry that someone he'd dismissed as powerless had turned out to possess the ability to hold him accountable. You're absolutely right, I said, allowing him to see the satisfaction in my expression. This is about consequences. You spent Friday evening explaining to a room full of your friends that I was a predatory lender who profited from other people's desperation. You called me street garbage in designer clothing and suggested that I was too stupid to understand my proper place in your social hierarchy. Robert's face flushed with the kind of defensive anger that came from being forced to confront his own behavior. I was drunk. People say things they don't mean when they've been drinking. That's hardly grounds for destroying a man's livelihood. Were you lying when you called me garbage, or are you lying now when you claim you didn't mean it? I stood up and walked to the window, forcing him to turn and follow my movement. Because from where I'm standing, it seems like Friday night was the first time you'd been honest about your real feelings. What do you want? The question came out as a desperate plea, all pretense of negotiation or dignified compromise abandoned. An apology, a public retraction. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. What I want is for you to understand something that should have been obvious from the beginning. You spent 3 years borrowing money from a company you would have refused to do business with if you'd known who actually owned it. You've been subsidizing the success of someone you consider fundamentally inferior to yourself and your social circle. Every month when you made your loan payments, you were contributing to the prosperity of the street garbage you publicly dismissed. Robert's expression shifted from anger to something approaching horror as the full implications of what I was saying began to register. The woman he'd humiliated on Friday night wasn't just connected to his financial problems. She was the source of his financial salvation for the past 3 years. Every dollar he'd borrowed, every extension he'd received, every accommodation Brooks Capital had made for his struggling business had come from someone he'd considered unworthy of basic respect. You've been playing some kind of game, he said, his voice hollow with the realization that he'd been completely outmaneuvered by someone he'd never taken seriously as an opponent. Pretending to be something you're not, hiding your real identity, setting me up for this moment. I've been running a legitimate business while maintaining appropriate privacy about my personal relationships and professional activities. The fact that you never bothered to research who you were actually dealing with is your failure, not my deception. Robert slumped into the chair he'd previously refused, the fight going out of him as the scope of his miscalculation became clear. What will it take to stop this? Name your price. I'll pay whatever you want. Do whatever you demand. Just don't destroy everything I've built. The offer was tempting in its complete capitulation, but it missed the fundamental point of what was happening. This wasn't about extracting payment or securing advantage in future business dealings. This was about demonstrating that actions had consequences, that respect couldn't be withdrawn and restored based on convenience, and that power sometimes resided in unexpected places. Mr. Chen, let me explain something about how the world actually works. When you publicly humiliate someone, you're not just expressing your personal opinions. You're making a statement about their worth, their place in society, and their right to be treated with dignity. You're also making a bet that they don't possess the ability to respond effectively. I returned to my desk and sat down, maintaining eye contact as I delivered the lesson he should have learned decades earlier. Friday night, you made that bet with someone who spent years building exactly the kind of power you thought you could dismiss. You gambled that I would accept your judgment, internalize your assessment of my worth, and quietly disappear from your son's life, rather than risk further humiliation. I was wrong, he said quietly. I underestimated you, and I'm sorry. But please don't punish 47 employees for my mistakes. They have families, mortgages, children in college. They don't deserve to suffer because of something stupid I said at a party. You're right, they don't deserve to suffer for your mistakes, which is why I've structured the foreclosure proceedings to favor buyers, who will retain existing staff and honor current employment contracts. Your employees will probably end up better off under new management, working for people who understand cash flow, risk assessment, and the importance of maintaining professional relationships. Robert's shoulders sagged as he realized that I'd anticipated even his most sympathetic arguments, and neutralized them in advance. There would be no emotional leverage, no appeal to broader principles, no way to transform this from a business consequence into a personal negotiation. So this is it, he asked. Everything I've worked for my entire life, gone because of one stupid night. Everything you've worked for is gone because you built it on a foundation of borrowed money you couldn't repay, and business practices you couldn't sustain. Friday night just determined who would control the timing of your inevitable collapse. Robert stood up slowly, moving like a man who'd aged years in the space of a single conversation. I'll fight this, he said, though his voice carried no conviction. I have attorneys, connections, resources you can't match. You have attorneys who'll explain that every document you signed with Brooks Capital is legally binding and properly executed. You have connections who are already distancing themselves from what they correctly perceive as a sinking ship, and your resources consist primarily of assets that I'm about to foreclose on. He walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. What about David? Are you going to destroy my relationship with my son as part of your revenge? Your relationship with David will be whatever you make it. I'm not interested in coming between a father and son, but I'm also not going to pretend that Friday night didn't happen or accept that it was somehow my fault for existing in your presence. He'll never forgive you for this. Maybe not, but at least he'll know I have principles that can't be bought, intimidated, or negotiated away when it becomes inconvenient to maintain them. After Robert left, I sat in the quiet of my office and felt the weight of what I'd just set in motion. By this time tomorrow, Chen Construction would be in crisis mode, scrambling to find alternative financing that didn't exist and trying to salvage projects that would now be legally frozen. By the end of the week, Robert's business empire would be completely dismantled, his personal assets liquidated, and his reputation as a successful entrepreneur permanently destroyed. The satisfaction I felt was complex and not entirely comfortable. This wasn't the kind of victory that came from building something better or creating new opportunities for people who needed them. This was purely destructive, the financial equivalent of burning down a house to prove you owned matches. But sometimes destruction was necessary to clear space for something better, and sometimes the only way to demonstrate the true cost of cruelty was to present the bill in full. Caroline knocked on my door at 2 o'clock with an update on the media response to the morning's events. 3 different business publications had called requesting comment on the Chen Construction foreclosures, and 2 local television stations were preparing segments on what they were characterizing as an unusual pattern of coordinated legal action against a prominent local business. How do you want to handle the publicity? She asked. We can continue with our standard no comment on specific borrower relationships position, or we can be more proactive about explaining our side of the story. Let's schedule a press conference for Thursday morning, I decided. By then the initial shock will have worn off, and people will be looking for context about what actually happened and why. I want to control that narrative rather than letting other people speculate about my motivations. Are you planning to mention Friday night's incident? I'm planning to explain that Brooks Capital evaluates borrowers based on character and judgment as well as financial performance, and that recent events provided important new information in those categories. People can draw their own conclusions about what that means. The rest of Monday passed in a blur of legal filings, media inquiries, and strategic planning for the complex process of liquidating Robert's assets while protecting innocent third parties. Each hour brought new confirmation that the plan was working exactly as designed, creating maximum impact while maintaining complete legal and ethical justification for every action we were taking. By evening, word was spreading through Hartford's business community that something significant was happening in the commercial real estate market. Robert Chen's name was being whispered in the same breath as terms like foreclosure, bankruptcy, and financial collapse, creating the kind of reputation damage that would survive long after the legal proceedings were complete. David called at 7:30, his voice hollow with the recognition that the relationship we'd built over 8 months was ending not because of anything we'd done to each other, but because of forces and loyalties neither of us could control. "I heard about the press conference," he said without preamble. "Are you going to tell them about Friday night? About what he said to you?" "I'm going to tell them that Brooks Capital maintains high standards for character and judgment in our business relationships and that we don't hesitate to enforce contractual remedies when those standards aren't met. That'll destroy him completely. Not just financially but personally. Everyone will know that he brought this on himself through his own behavior. Yes, they will, and maybe that will serve as a lesson to other people who think they can treat others with cruelty and contempt without facing consequences." David was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear the weight of impossible choices in his breathing. "I understand why you're doing this," he finally said, "and if I'm honest, part of me thinks he deserves everything that's happening to him. But I can't be with someone who's willing to destroy my family, even if they had it coming." "I know," I replied, feeling the loss more acutely than I'd expected, "and I can't be with someone who thinks I should accept being publicly humiliated in exchange for access to their social circle." We both knew this was always a possibility. "I love you," he said, and I could hear tears in his voice. "I want you to know that regardless of how this ends, I love you and I'm proud of what you've accomplished, and I think you're the strongest person I've ever known." "I love you too. But love isn't always enough to overcome the differences in how we see the world and our place in it." After hanging up, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood at my window watching the city lights reflect off the snow-covered streets. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Robert's attorneys scrambled to find legal strategies that didn't exist and his business associates tried to distance themselves from the wreckage. By Thursday, the press conference would make everything public, transforming a private conflict into a very public lesson about respect, consequences, and the price of underestimating people based on their backgrounds. But tonight, I allowed myself to grieve for what I was losing as well as celebrate what I was gaining. David had been a good man caught between competing loyalties, and our relationship had been real despite the impossible circumstances surrounding it. The fact that it was ending didn't diminish what we'd shared, but it did underscore the reality that some bridges couldn't be built across certain kinds of differences. Robert Chen had forced this choice on all of us when he decided that public humiliation was an appropriate way to express his disapproval of his son's relationship. Tomorrow he would begin learning the true cost of that decision, and by the end of the week, everyone would understand that respect, once lost, could not be simply restored through apologies or negotiations. The lesson was expensive, but some lessons needed to be. Tuesday morning brought a winter storm that blanketed Hartford in 8 inches of fresh snow, creating the kind of pristine landscape that made the city look innocent and peaceful despite the corporate warfare raging beneath its white surface. From my office window, I watched maintenance crews clear the sidewalks while business executives hurried between buildings, their expensive overcoats and leather briefcases marking them as members of the same privileged class that Robert Chen had represented before his world began its spectacular collapse. The second wave of acceleration notices had been delivered at dawn, targeting Robert's personal mortgages and credit lines with the same surgical precision we'd used against his commercial properties. Caroline's morning briefing confirmed that the psychological impact was exceeding our most optimistic projections. Robert's attempts to secure emergency financing had been unsuccessful, his calls to longtime business associates were going unreturned, and his attorneys were preparing bankruptcy filings that would formally acknowledge what everyone already knew: Chen construction was finished. Marcus arrived for our 8 o'clock strategy session carrying coffee and the kind of grim satisfaction that lawyers felt when their careful planning produced flawless results. The foreclosure proceedings were moving exactly as designed, with each legal filing creating new pressure points that would force Robert to confront the totality of his situation. More importantly, the structured nature of the process was protecting innocent parties while ensuring that the man responsible for creating this mess would bear the full weight of its consequences. "The media attention is intensifying," Marcus reported, spreading newspaper clippings across the conference table. Hartford Business Journal is running a front-page story about the Chen construction collapse, and they're asking pointed questions about the coincidental timing of multiple foreclosure actions. "Someone's going to make the connection between Brooks Capital and your personal relationship with the family. I studied the headlines, noting how the business press was framing the story as a cautionary tale about over-leveraging and poor financial management rather than the personal conflict that had actually triggered the timing. The narrative was accurate as far as it went, but incomplete in ways that would soon become significant. By Thursday's press conference, I would need to provide enough context for people to understand the broader lesson without appearing vindictive or unprofessional. "What's the word from Robert's legal team?" I asked. "Are they planning to fight the foreclosures or focus on damage control?" "Both unsuccessfully. They've filed motions challenging the acceleration clauses, but the contract language is airtight and the financial triggers are clearly documented. They're also reaching out to potential investors, but nobody wants to pour money into a company that's being systematically dismantled by its primary lender." Caroline pulled up financial reports on the large monitor, showing real-time updates on asset liquidations and debt restructuring. "The commercial properties will be auctioned next week, and we already have 3 qualified bidders who've committed to retaining existing employees. Chen Construction's equipment and inventory are being appraised for separate sales, and the development projects will likely be transferred to the new property owners for completion." The efficiency of the process was almost beautiful in its mathematical precision. Within 10 days, Robert Chen's business empire would be completely reorganized under new ownership, his employees would transition to more stable employers, and his clients would see their projects completed on schedule. The only casualty would be Robert himself, stripped of his wealth, reputation and position but left with the opportunity to rebuild his life on a foundation of humility rather than inherited privilege. My phone buzzed with a text message from David, sent at 7:43 that morning. Dad spent the night at his lawyer's office. "Mom is talking about moving in with her sister in Florida. This is tearing our family apart, and I don't know how to fix it." The pain in those words was genuine and heartbreaking, but it also revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had made this conflict inevitable. David still thought in terms of fixing things, finding compromises that would allow everyone to pretend that Friday night had never happened and return to the comfortable status quo. He couldn't see that some actions created permanent changes, that some words couldn't be unsaid, and that some relationships couldn't survive the revelation of their underlying dynamics. I typed back carefully, choosing words that would be honest without being unnecessarily cruel. "Some things can't be fixed, only resolved. Your family is experiencing the natural consequences of choices your father made over many years. The crisis you're seeing now was always inevitable. Friday night just determined the timing." The response came immediately, suggesting David had been waiting for my reply, "But it doesn't have to be this complete. You could stop the foreclosures, accept his apology, find a way to move forward. People make mistakes when they're drinking. It shouldn't cost him everything." His plea revealed everything wrong with his understanding of power, privilege and accountability. David genuinely believed that Robert's wealth and social position should insulate him from the full consequences of his behavior. That a sincere apology could somehow undo the damage of public humiliation, and that I should be grateful enough for his family's eventual acceptance to overlook their initial cruelty. "David," I wrote back, "your father didn't make a drunken mistake. He revealed his true feelings about me, my background, and my place in his social hierarchy. The drinking didn't create those opinions, it just made him honest about them. What you're really asking is for me to accept that I deserve to be treated with contempt as long as it's done privately rather than publicly." The typing indicator appeared and disappeared several times, suggesting David was struggling to find a response that would bridge the gap between his desire to protect his family and his recognition that I might actually be right about what had happened. When the message finally came through, it carried the weight of someone finally understanding that good intentions couldn't solve problems rooted in fundamental differences about respect and dignity. "I wish things were different," he wrote. "I wish my father was different. I wish our families came from similar backgrounds. I wish none of this had ever happened. But most of all, I wish I was brave enough to choose you over everything I've ever known. I'm sorry I'm not that person." The honesty of his admission was both devastating and liberating. David was essentially acknowledging that he lacked the courage to challenge his family's values, even when he knew they were wrong, and that he would choose familiar dysfunction over unfamiliar growth. It was a decision I could understand even if I couldn't respect it, and it confirmed that ending our relationship was the only option that preserved both our dignities. "I wish you were that person too," I replied. "But I understand why you're not. Take care of yourself, David. Despite everything that's happened, I hope you find happiness." The morning's other significant development came in the form of an unexpected call from Linda Chen, David's mother and the only member of the family who'd shown any genuine warmth during our previous interactions. Her voice carried the strained politeness of someone making a call she'd been dreading but felt obligated to complete. "Natalie, I hope you don't mind me calling directly. I got your number from David, and I wanted to speak with you privately about the situation with Robert and the business." "Of course, Mrs. Chen, I'm happy to listen to what you have to say. First, I want to apologize for Friday night. What Robert said about you was inexcusable, and I should have spoken up to stop it. I was embarrassed by his behavior, but I was also cowardly about confronting it in public. That was wrong of me." The apology was unexpected and genuine, carrying none of the defensive anger or calculated positioning that had characterized Robert's desperate attempts to undo the damage. Linda Chen had always struck me as someone who'd been worn down by years of managing her husband's social aggression while protecting her children from its worst effects. "I appreciate you saying that, Mrs. Chen. I know it couldn't have been easy to witness, and I understand the difficulty of challenging someone's behavior in front of their friends. Linda, please. And I want you to know that not everyone in that room agreed with what Robert was saying. Several people looked uncomfortable, and I heard at least 2 conversations afterward where people criticized his treatment of you. He doesn't speak for all of us. The information was useful but not surprising. Robert's performance had been designed to assert dominance rather than reflect consensus, and experienced observers of social dynamics would have recognized it as such. But their private disapproval hadn't translated into public support when I'd needed it, which said something important about the difference between disagreeing with cruelty and being willing to confront it. Linda, can I ask you something? Did Robert's comments about me come as a surprise to you, or had he been expressing similar views privately?" The long pause that followed suggested she was debating how honest to be about her family's internal dynamics. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weariness of someone who'd been fighting losing battles for years. "Robert has always been judgmental about people he considers beneath his social class. It's gotten worse as he's gotten older, and it's been a source of tension in our marriage for decades. I've tried to moderate his worst impulses, but I've also enabled them by not confronting him more directly. So Friday night wasn't an aberration. It was just the first time he felt comfortable saying those things publicly." "Yes," she said quietly, "and I know that makes what's happening now seem like inevitable consequences rather than excessive punishment. I can't argue that Robert didn't bring this on himself through his own choices and behavior." The conversation was taking an interesting turn, moving away from desperate pleas for mercy towards something approaching acceptance of responsibility. Linda Chen was clearly intelligent enough to understand the connection between her husband's actions and their results, even if she was struggling with the magnitude of the consequences he was facing. "Linda, I want you to know that I take no pleasure in what's happening to your family. This isn't about revenge or destroying lives for the sake of destruction. It's about demonstrating that actions have consequences, even for people who've been insulated from them by wealth and privilege. I understand that, and I respect what you're trying to accomplish. But I also have to ask, is there any way to resolve this that doesn't completely destroy everything Robert has built? He's made terrible mistakes, but 40 years of work and dozens of families depend on that business." The question was fair, and showed that Linda was thinking beyond her immediate family's interests to consider the broader impact of the foreclosure actions. It also gave me an opportunity to explain the care we'd taken to protect innocent parties while holding the responsible person accountable. "The business will survive under new ownership, and we've structured the transition to protect all existing employees. Robert's workers will probably be better off with management that understands cash flow and risk assessment. The only person who will lose everything is the person who created the problems in the first place. And Robert himself. Robert will have the opportunity to rebuild his life and his career based on his actual abilities rather than inherited advantages. It might be the best thing that's ever happened to him, though I doubt he'll see it that way initially." Linda was quiet for several moments, processing the implications of what I was saying. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of something that might have been relief mixed with sadness. "You know, there's a part of me that's almost grateful this is happening. Robert has needed a wake-up call for years, and nothing less dramatic would have gotten through to him. Maybe losing everything will force him to confront some truths about himself that he's been avoiding. Maybe people respond to crisis in different ways. Some learn and grow from the experience, while others just become bitter and blame everyone else for their problems. I can't control which direction Robert chooses, but I can make sure the consequences of his choices are clear and proportionate." What about David? He's torn apart by having to choose between you and his family. Is there any way to separate your personal relationship from the business situation? The question went to the heart of why this conflict had become so devastating for everyone involved. David wanted to compartmentalize his family's business problems from his romantic relationship, but that wasn't possible when the business problems were directly connected to his father's treatment of his girlfriend. Linda, David is a good man who's been caught in an impossible situation. But the reality is that your husband's behavior toward me revealed fundamental differences in how our families view respect, dignity, and social responsibility. Those differences existed long before Friday night, and they would have created problems eventually regardless of the business complications. So you're saying the relationship was doomed anyway? I'm saying that sustainable relationships require mutual respect and shared values. David loves me, but he also can't fully separate himself from a family culture that sees me as fundamentally inferior. That's not his fault, but it's also not something that can be overcome through good intentions alone. The conversation wound down with Linda expressing her hope that time and distance might eventually allow for some kind of reconciliation, though we both understood that the bridges being burned this week were unlikely to be rebuilt. She promised to try to moderate Robert's worst impulses as he dealt with the collapse of his business, and I promised to ensure that the liquidation process remained focused on business necessity rather than personal vindictiveness. Wednesday brought the first significant pushback from Robert's professional network, as several prominent members of Hartford's business community began questioning whether Brooks Capital's actions were proportionate to whatever had triggered them. The criticism was predictable and largely uninformed, coming from people who understood the financial mechanics of foreclosure but had no insight into the personal dynamics that had precipitated this particular crisis. Caroline fielded calls from 3 different industry publications asking for comment on allegations that Brooks Capital was using its position as a lender to settle personal scores rather than enforce legitimate business remedies. The questions were hostile and clearly based on information provided by Robert's supporters, but they also gave us an opportunity to frame the narrative before Thursday's press conference. The criticism is actually helpful, Marcus observed during our morning strategy meeting. It forces us to articulate our position clearly, and demonstrates that we're confident enough in our legal and ethical standing to face public scrutiny. Robert's people are trying to make this about personal vendetta, which plays into our hands when we reveal the full context. I spent Wednesday afternoon preparing for the press conference, reviewing talking points and anticipating questions that would likely arise once the business community understood the connection between Brooks Capital's foreclosure actions and Robert's behavior at the holiday party. The challenge was providing enough context for people to understand our motivations without appearing vindictive or unprofessional. The key message was simple: Brooks Capital maintained high standards for character and judgment in all business relationships, and we didn't hesitate to enforce contractual remedies when those standards weren't met. Recent events had provided new information about Robert Chen's character and judgment, information that was directly relevant to our assessment of him as a borrower and business partner. Thursday morning's press conference was held in the main conference room of Brooks Capital's offices, with representatives from 6 different media outlets in attendance. I'd chosen to conduct the event on our own territory, rather than at a hotel or neutral venue, partly for logistical convenience, but mostly to reinforce the message that we were operating from a position of strength and confidence. The questions began with standard inquiries about the technical aspects of the foreclosure process, giving me an opportunity to establish that every action we'd taken was legally justified and properly documented. The Chen construction collapse wasn't the result of arbitrary or vindictive behavior. It was the predictable consequence of over-leveraging, poor financial management, and the company's inability to meet its contractual obligations. Ms. Brooks, asked Janet Morrison from the Hartford Business Journal, critics are suggesting that the timing of these foreclosure actions suggests personal rather than business motivations. How do you respond to allegations that Brooks Capital is using its position to settle scores rather than enforce legitimate contracts? The question was exactly what I'd been expecting, and it gave me the opening I needed to provide context without appearing defensive. Brooks Capital evaluates borrowers based on multiple factors including financial performance, business judgment, and personal character. Recent events provided significant new information about Mr. Chen's character and judgment, information that was directly relevant to our assessment of him as a long-term business partner. Can you be more specific about what events you're referring to? Mr. Chen chose to publicly characterize me as a predatory lender who profits from other people's desperation. He described my business practices as unethical and suggested that I was fundamentally unfit to be associated with respectable members of the business community. These comments were made without any knowledge of my actual business practices or professional standards, and they revealed a level of prejudice and poor judgment that raised serious questions about his fitness as a borrower. The room was quiet as reporters processed the implications of what I'd just revealed. The story was suddenly much more interesting than a simple foreclosure dispute. It was about consequences, accountability, and the intersection of personal behavior and business relationships. "Are you saying that Mr. Chen didn't know he was borrowing money from your company?" asked Tom Rodriguez from Channel 8 News. Chen borrowed money from Brooks Capital Management for 3 years without ever researching the ownership structure of the company or understanding who he was actually dealing with. He made assumptions based on his prejudices rather than facts, and those assumptions led him to publicly criticize the very person whose discretion and professionalism had enabled his business to survive its recent financial difficulties. So this is about revenge. This is about natural consequences. Mr. Chen spent Friday evening explaining to a room full of people that I was unfit to be associated with respectable business leaders. Monday morning, he discovered that his own business survival depended entirely on maintaining a professional relationship with someone he'd publicly dismissed as beneath his standards. The irony was complete before I took any action. I simply ensured that Mr. Chen understood the implications of his choices. The press conference continued for another 20 minutes, with questions ranging from technical details about the foreclosure process to broader issues about accountability in business relationships. By the end, it was clear that the media understood the story's real significance. This wasn't just about one man's financial collapse, but about the price of arrogance and the importance of treating people with respect regardless of their backgrounds. Thursday evening brought a call from Patricia Wong, one of Robert's business associates who'd been present at Friday night's holiday party. Her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone trying to navigate between competing loyalties while protecting her own interests. "Natalie, I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from Linda Chen, and I wanted to discuss the situation with Robert and the business community's response to recent events." "Of course, Patricia, I'm happy to hear your perspective. I was at the country club Friday night, and I heard what Robert said about you. At the time I thought his comments were inappropriate and cruel, but I didn't speak up because I was trying to avoid confrontation. I realize now that my silence was essentially complicity." The admission was interesting and suggested that Robert's support network was beginning to fracture as people reassessed their association with his behavior. Patricia Wong was a shrewd businesswoman who understood the importance of being on the right side of shifting social dynamics. "I appreciate your honesty about that night. It took courage to make this call. What's happening to Robert is terrible, but I have to admit that part of me thinks he brought it on himself. The way he spoke about you revealed attitudes that I've always found troubling, even when they weren't directed at someone I knew personally." "Patricia, can I ask you something? Was Robert's behavior Friday night typical of how he talks about people he considers beneath his social class?" "Unfortunately, yes. Robert has always been judgmental and dismissive toward people he perceives as having less money, education, or social status. Most of us have learned to ignore it or change the subject when he starts holding forth about proper breeding and knowing your place. I think we all enabled his worst impulses by not challenging him more directly." The conversation provided valuable insight into the social dynamics that had made Friday night possible. Robert's cruelty hadn't emerged from nowhere. It was the culmination of years of unchallenged prejudice and social reinforcement from people who found his attitudes distasteful but were unwilling to confront them. What's the mood in the business community now that the full story is coming out? Mixed. Some people think you've gone too far, that the punishment doesn't fit the crime. But others are saying it's about time someone held Robert accountable for his behavior. There's also a lot of discussion about how this changes the social dynamics at future events. People are realizing that they can't assume the person they're talking about doesn't have the power to respond. The observation was perceptive and captured exactly the broader lesson I'd hoped this situation would teach. Social cruelty had been tolerated for too long because its victims were assumed to be powerless to respond effectively. When that assumption proved wrong, it forced everyone to reconsider the risks of casual prejudice and public humiliation. Friday morning brought news that Robert Chen had filed for both personal and corporate bankruptcy, formally acknowledging what had been obvious since Monday's acceleration notices. The filing was accompanied by a statement from his attorneys describing the foreclosure actions as excessive and disproportionate, but notably absent was any denial of the behavior that had triggered the crisis. Caroline's analysis of the bankruptcy documents revealed that Robert's financial situation was even worse than we'd realized. Beyond the loans held by Brooks Capital, he owed substantial amounts to suppliers, subcontractors, and private investors who had trusted his reputation rather than conducting thorough due diligence. The business collapse would create ripple effects throughout Hartford's construction industry, though the structured nature of our foreclosure process would minimize the damage to innocent parties. The employee transition is going better than expected, Caroline reported. Two of the companies acquiring Chen Construction's assets have already extended job offers to all existing staff, and several workers are actually getting raises as part of the transition. The new owners understand that keeping experienced teams intact is crucial for project continuity. Marcus joined our morning briefing with updates on the legal aftermath of Thursday's press conference. The media coverage had been extensive and largely favorable, with most outlets framing the story as a cautionary tale about accountability and consequences rather than a personal vendetta. More importantly, the publicity had generated interest from other businesses that wanted to work with Brooks Capital, suggesting that our reputation for holding people to high standards was being viewed as an asset rather than a liability. We've received inquiries from 3 major development companies about financing for upcoming projects, Marcus reported. They specifically mentioned being impressed by our commitment to character assessment as part of the underwriting process. Apparently, there are a lot of business leaders who are tired of dealing with people like Robert Chen. The irony wasn't lost on me that Robert's public humiliation of someone he'd considered inferior had ultimately enhanced rather than damaged my professional reputation. The story of Brooks Capital holding a borrower accountable for poor character and judgment was resonating with business leaders who'd grown tired of tolerating casual cruelty and social prejudice in their professional relationships. My phone rang at 11:30 with a call from David, the first time we'd spoken directly since our text exchange earlier in the week. His voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd spent 5 days watching his familiar world collapse while being powerless to stop it. Natalie, I saw the press conference coverage. I wanted to call and tell you that I think you handled it perfectly. You were honest about what happened without being cruel or vindictive about it. Thank you, that balance was important to me. I also wanted to apologize for asking you to accept less than you deserved from my family. I understand now that what you did wasn't about revenge. It was about refusing to accept disrespect. I should have supported that from the beginning. The evolution in David's thinking was significant and suggested that he'd spent the week truly examining the situation rather than just reacting emotionally to its consequences. But understanding and accepting weren't the same as being able to change, and we both knew that insight alone couldn't bridge the fundamental differences that had made this conflict inevitable. David, I appreciate you saying that. It means more than you know to hear that you understand my perspective. But it doesn't change anything, does it? I'm still my father's son, and you're still someone who won't tolerate being treated as less than equal. Those facts aren't compatible with the kind of relationship we both wanted. No, they're not. And that's not anyone's fault, it's just reality. We both tried to build something beautiful despite the obstacles, and we succeeded for a while. The fact that it couldn't survive external pressure doesn't diminish what we shared. I'm going to miss you, he said quietly. Not just the relationship, but having someone in my life who challenges me to be better than I was raised to be. You can still be better, David. The person you choose to become from here isn't determined by your family's values or expectations. This crisis has shown you things about yourself and your world that you might never have seen otherwise. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. After ending the call with David, I spent the rest of Friday afternoon reviewing the week's events and their broader implications. Robert Chen's business empire was gone, his reputation was destroyed, and his family relationships were permanently altered. But the employees of Chen Construction were transitioning to better opportunities. The company's clients would see their projects completed, and the broader business community had received a clear message about accountability and consequences. More importantly, I demonstrated something that needed demonstrating, that success could be built through merit rather than inheritance, that respect had to be earned rather than assumed, and that actions had consequences regardless of social position or economic status. The lesson had been expensive for Robert Chen, but some lessons couldn't be taught any other way. The snow had stopped falling by evening, leaving Hartford covered in a clean white blanket that would last until Monday morning's traffic turned it into gray slush. The metaphor felt appropriate: surface beauty hiding the messy realities underneath, pristine appearances that couldn't survive contact with the real world. From my office window, I watched the city's lights twinkle in the darkness and reflected on the week that had transformed a personal humiliation into a professional triumph. Robert Chen had thought he was putting me in my place when he'd publicly dismissed me as street garbage in designer clothing. Instead, he'd revealed the true nature of power, respect, and consequences in ways that would reshape how Hartford's business community thought about character and accountability. The most expensive lesson a man could learn, indeed. But also, perhaps, the most necessary one. 6 months later, I stood in the same penthouse office where I'd planned Robert Chen's downfall, but the view from my windows told a completely different story. The Hartford skyline gleamed in the late spring sunshine, construction cranes dotting the horizon as the city experienced an unexpected boom in commercial development. 3 of those projects were being financed through Brooks Capital, led by former Chen construction employees who'd used their severance packages and industry connections to launch their own firms. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. Marcus Rodriguez, Robert's former project manager, now ran Hartford Premier Development with contracts worth $12 million and a reputation for completing projects ahead of schedule and under budget. Sarah Kim, who'd been Chen Construction's head of operations, had partnered with 2 other former employees to create Riverside Commercial Builders, specializing in sustainable construction practices that were attracting environmentally conscious clients throughout New England. Most satisfying of all was watching these newly independent contractors treat their own employees with the respect and professionalism that Robert had never demonstrated. They'd learned from his mistakes, understanding that success in business required building people up rather than tearing them down. The ripple effects of that February morning when Robert's empire collapsed had created opportunities for dozens of people who'd been held back by his limited vision and social prejudices. Caroline knocked on my office door with her afternoon briefing, a routine that had evolved considerably since the Chen situation had made Brooks Capital a household name in Hartford's business community. Our client base had expanded by 40%, with companies specifically seeking us out because of our reputation for maintaining high standards in professional relationships. The story of holding a borrower accountable for character defects as well as financial performance had resonated far beyond Connecticut's borders. The Hartford Business Journal wants to do a follow-up piece on the Chen construction aftermath. Caroline reported, settling into the chair across from my desk with her ever-present tablet and coffee. They're calling it 6 months later, lessons from Connecticut's most talked about foreclosure. Apparently business schools are using our case study in their ethics courses. The academic interest had been unexpected but gratifying. 3 different universities had reached out requesting detailed information about our decision-making process, wanting to understand how we'd balanced legal remedies with ethical considerations, while protecting innocent parties from collateral damage. The case had become a template for responsible corporate accountability, demonstrating that businesses could enforce high standards without destroying lives unnecessarily. What's the current status on Robert himself? I asked, though I'd been following his situation through industry contacts and public records. The man who'd once commanded a construction empire from a corner office in downtown Hartford had been forced to rebuild his life from scratch, working as a project consultant for a small firm in Springfield, Massachusetts. He's actually doing better than anyone expected, Caroline replied, consulting her notes. The bankruptcy process was completed in March, and he's been steadily rebuilding his reputation through smaller projects and subcontractor relationships. Several people have commented that losing everything seems to have forced him to develop some humility and self-awareness. The information wasn't entirely surprising. Crisis had a way of revealing character, and sometimes the revelation was positive rather than negative. Robert Chen had been forced to confront truths about himself that wealth and privilege had previously allowed him to avoid. The question was whether those lessons would produce lasting change or simply temporary adaptation to reduced circumstances. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, sent that morning at 9:47. Miss Brooks, this is Robert Chen. I know I have no right to contact you, but I wanted you to know that I've spent the past 6 months thinking about what happened and why it was necessary. I owe you an apology that I should have offered long ago. Thank you for teaching me something I needed to learn. The message sat on my screen for several minutes as I considered how to respond, if at all. Robert's attempt at reconciliation was clearly sincere, but it also raised questions about motivation and timing. Was this genuine growth and self-reflection, or was it strategic positioning designed to rehabilitate his reputation and open doors that remained closed to him? I decided that his motivations mattered less than the message itself. Whether driven by genuine remorse or calculated self-interest, Robert's acknowledgement that the consequences he'd faced were justified and necessary represented a kind of closure that I hadn't expected to receive. Mr. Chen, I typed back, I appreciate you reaching out and acknowledging the lessons from our experience. I hope you're finding success in your new circumstances and that the insights you've gained serve you well going forward. The response was professional and polite without being warm or encouraging. Robert had earned the right to apologize, but he hadn't earned forgiveness or friendship. Some bridges, once burned, could never be fully rebuilt, and some relationships were better left in the past where they couldn't cause new damage. Caroline was reviewing financial reports when David walked into my office unannounced, looking healthier and more confident than he had during our painful goodbye 6 months earlier. His appearance was a surprise but not entirely unexpected. Hartford's business community was small enough that crossing paths was inevitable, especially given Brooks Capital's expanded profile in local development projects. I hope you don't mind me dropping by without an appointment, he said, his voice carrying the same warmth that had first attracted me but tempered now with a maturity that suggested genuine growth. I was meeting with Marcus Rodriguez about a consulting contract, and I thought this might be a good opportunity to talk. Caroline excused herself tactfully, gathering her materials and closing the door behind her as she left. David took the chair she'd vacated, settling in with the careful posture of someone who wasn't entirely sure of his welcome, but was determined to complete a difficult conversation. "You look good," he said, and I could hear genuine happiness in his voice despite the complicated history between us. Caroline mentioned that business has been incredible since February. "I'm glad to see that standing up for your principles has been rewarded professionally as well as personally. Thank you. I heard you've been working with some of the new companies that emerged from your father's collapse. That can't be easy given everything that happened." David's smile was rueful but genuine. "Actually, it's been liberating in ways I didn't expect. Working with Marcus and Sarah, and the others, has shown me what healthy business relationships look like when they're built on mutual respect rather than inherited hierarchy. I'm learning skills I never developed while I was coasting on family connections." The conversation felt surprisingly comfortable despite the emotional weight it carried. David had clearly spent the past 6 months examining his values and priorities, and the person sitting across from me seemed more grounded and self-aware than the man I dated during our 8-month relationship. "I wanted to tell you something," he continued, his expression becoming more serious. "Last week I was at a client meeting where someone made dismissive comments about a vendor's background and qualifications. Instead of staying silent or changing the subject like I would have done before, I spoke up. I told them that competence and character were more important than pedigree, and that their attitude was both unprofessional and counterproductive. How did that go over?" "Better than I expected." The client apologized and admitted they'd been making assumptions based on prejudice rather than facts. The vendor turned out to be exactly what we needed for the project, and the client has since referred 2 other businesses to us based on their positive experience. David's story illustrated exactly the kind of cultural change that I'd hoped Robert's downfall would inspire. When people understood that casual prejudice and social cruelty could have real consequences, they became more careful about their behavior and more willing to challenge discriminatory attitudes in others. "I'm proud of you for speaking up," I said, meaning it completely. That kind of courage becomes easier with practice, but it always requires a conscious choice to do the right thing, even when it's uncomfortable. "I learned that from watching you handle the situation with my father. You could have accepted his insults, walked away quietly, and avoided all the drama that followed. Instead, you chose to demonstrate that actions have consequences and that respect isn't optional. That took more courage than I possessed at the time." We talked for another 20 minutes about his work, his family, and the ways the past 6 months had changed his perspective on success and relationships. Robert was slowly rebuilding his relationship with his children, though it would never return to its previous dynamic of unquestioning loyalty and financial dependence. Linda had moved to Florida temporarily, but was considering returning to Hartford now that the immediate crisis had passed and emotions had cooled somewhat. "There's something else I wanted to tell you." David said as our conversation wound down. I'm engaged to someone I met through the consulting work. Her name is Rachel, and she's a civil engineer who grew up in circumstances similar to yours. She's brilliant, independent, and completely unimpressed by social status or family connections. The news should have stung, but instead I felt genuine happiness for him. David had clearly learned from our relationship's failure, seeking out a partner whose values aligned with his evolving worldview, rather than someone who fit into his family's traditional expectations. I'm happy for you, I said, surprised by how much I meant it. She sounds like exactly the kind of person who'll challenge you to keep growing. She does, and she knows about what happened between us, about my father's behavior, and how you responded to it. She said it showed her that she could trust me to do the right thing when it really mattered, even if it took me a while to figure out what that was. David left with a handshake and wishes for continued success, both of us understanding that this conversation had provided closure to a chapter that needed to end before new ones could begin. His growth and happiness vindicated my belief that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was refuse to accept less than what both people deserved. The afternoon brought a call from Rose, my elderly neighbor, who'd become something of a confidant during the difficult months following Robert's collapse. At 83, she possessed the kind of perspective that only came from witnessing decades of human drama and understanding which conflicts really mattered in the long run. I saw that young man leaving your building, she said without preamble when I answered her call. He looked much better than the last time I saw him, less confused and conflicted. I take it the conversation went well. Better than I expected. He's engaged to someone who sounds perfect for him, and he's learned to stand up for his principles even when it's difficult. I think the crisis forced him to examine his values and make some necessary changes. Good for him, and good for you for refusing to accept a relationship built on compromises that would have made you both miserable eventually. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is force people to confront truths they'd rather avoid. Rose's wisdom had been invaluable during the months when I'd questioned whether destroying Robert's business empire had been proportionate to the offense he'd committed. Her reminder that some lessons could only be taught through consequences had helped me maintain perspective when critics suggested I'd gone too far. I've been thinking about something you said back in February, I told her. About choosing between being accepted and being respected. I think I finally understand that they're not just different things, they're often incompatible things. Explain that thought. Acceptance often requires conforming to other people's expectations and tolerating treatment that compromises your dignity. Respect requires standing up for your principles, even when it costs you relationships or opportunities. The people who are worth having in your life will respect you for maintaining your standards, and the people who don't respect those standards aren't worth having in your life anyway. That's a hard lesson to learn, especially for someone who grew up without the security of family and social connections. But it's also the most important lesson, because it's the foundation for building relationships based on authenticity rather than accommodation. As evening approached, I found myself reflecting on the strange journey that had begun with champagne and Christmas carols at the Riverside Country Club and ended with a completely transformed understanding of power, respect, and accountability. Robert Chen's cruel words had been meant to diminish me, to remind me of my place in his social hierarchy, and discourage me from aspiring beyond what he considered appropriate for someone of my background. Instead, those words had revealed the true nature of our relationship and forced me to demonstrate that real power came from competence, character, and the courage to hold people accountable for their actions. The woman he'd dismissed as street garbage and designer clothing had turned out to control the financial instruments that kept his business empire afloat, and his assumptions about power and privilege had proven catastrophically wrong. The lesson had been expensive for Robert, but it had also been necessary. For too long, people like him had been able to express casual cruelty and social prejudice without facing meaningful consequences. When that immunity was removed, it forced everyone to reconsider the risks of treating others with contempt and the importance of maintaining professional standards in all relationships. 6 months later, Hartford's business community operated under different rules. People were more careful about their assumptions, more respectful in their interactions, and more willing to challenge discriminatory behavior when they encountered it. The ripple effects of that February morning had created a culture where competence mattered more than connections, and where character was valued as highly as capital. Brooks Capital had thrived in that environment, becoming the preferred lender for businesses that prioritized integrity and professionalism over traditional markers of social status. Our client base included former Chen construction employees who'd launched their own firms, minority-owned businesses that had struggled to find financing elsewhere, and established companies that wanted to work with partners who shared their values. The success was gratifying, but more important was the knowledge that I'd remained true to principles that couldn't be bought, intimidated, or negotiated away when maintaining them became inconvenient. Robert Chen had forced me to choose between acceptance and respect, between accommodation and authenticity. The choice had cost me a relationship I'd valued and created enemies I hadn't wanted, but it had also demonstrated something that needed demonstrating about consequences, accountability, and the true nature of power. Sometimes the most expensive lessons were also the most necessary ones. Robert had learned that respect couldn't be demanded or inherited, only earned through consistent behavior that demonstrated genuine character. I'd learned that standing up for principles would always be rewarded eventually, even when the immediate costs seemed overwhelming. And Hartford's business community had learned that assumptions about power could be dangerously wrong, that casual cruelty could have serious consequences, and that the person you underestimated might hold the keys to everything you thought you owned. The snow had long since melted, spring had given way to early summer, and the city hummed with new construction projects, led by people who understood that success was built through merit rather than manipulation. From my office window, I could see the future taking shape one building at a time, constructed by companies that treated their workers with dignity and their clients with respect. It was exactly the kind of world worth fighting for, one expensive lesson at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.